So we began our story with the senior pastor, Brian Houston, stepping down temporarily to answer past allegations of hiding his father's indiscretions. And then he resigned permanently when it became clear that he had some indiscretions of his own, surprising absolutely nobody.
No.
And what happens is people think that they can control information, but when the dam bursts, the dam bursts. And so now all the information that everybody was afraid to say out loud is being said out loud. Some interesting articles that I came across this week. One was a commentary on the legal structure of Hillsong Church, but this is really the legal structure of all megachurches, and partially kind of what your big thing against all megachurches is when you look at their articles of incorporation and their doctrine, they basically have a leadership structure that makes no accommodation towards members, right? So there will be no voting of any kind. The will of the body is irrelevant to the decisions of leaders. And then there's
That's a bit of a problem.
yeah, let me say the second one, then we can kind of talk about this all together. The second article I found was about a church in Ukraine, interestingly enough, very timely. And this was a church that tried to split from Hillsong. And basically what came out was how Hillsong had threatened them and had tried to extort them when this church made it clear they wanted to leave the larger Hillsong body. Doing things, so let me just, let's see. The pastor of this church, the pastor and his wife, they wanted to immigrate to America. Brian Houston and Hillsong Church threatened to derail their immigration plans. When they planned to sell the church, Hillsong Australia insisted that the proceeds from the sale, as well as a cash donation, was made to the larger Hillsong body.
Okay.
Right. And then thirdly, what we find out is, once again, in this entire shell game that is megachurchdom, we're just trying to find ways to shuffle money into people's pockets without getting caught. Right. So in other words, Hillsong is a huge network of churches. So let's have hugely popular Pastor A of Church A go do a guest message at Church C, right? Mm-hmm. And so Church C is going to give them an honorarium, but it's not going to be a couple $100. It's going to be like tens of thousands of dollars, just for coming to preach a message. And so all sorts of shady stuff going on in the Hillsong denomination.
Yeah, and this is like the gift that keeps on giving,
Yeah.
which is, when it's like a beer a month club, that's great.
Yeah.
But when it's, problems in a church, that's not so great.
Yeah.
And I know everything I've consumed regarding Hillsong recently has just kind of pointed all in the same direction, that like all these problems are basically Brian Houston's fault to begin with. It's like when you have a church built around a personality, that's an issue. But then his personality wasn't a particularly great one. Neither was his father's. So it's like I'm not really surprised that somebody is desperately trying to do really shady stuff, like extorting one of their own churches, when they want to leave the denomination, because it's a panic move.
Right.
It's like, it's somebody who has no morals. Okay, that's being unfair. Somebody who has lax morals, is doing morally lax things out of desperation. It's just not shocking anymore.
Yeah. That particular move, like we've talked before about how the church in America has totally hitched its wagon to the message and the religion of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And in the megachurch world especially, there is nothing that is no longer done that isn't in the name of making more money. Like every leader of a megachurch that I can think of seems to have a million ways to make a buck. It's almost like playing the stock market. Like if you listen to the super successful billionaire stock market players, they will all say the same thing. It's not about just putting money in the S&P 500 and watching it grow 8% a year. They say that's chump change. Mm-hmm. Really, where the real money is made is in volatility. in what's unknown and what's unknowable and what scares people and what makes people nervous and what makes people run to the grocery store to stock up on toilet paper, right? That kind of uncertainty is what investors are looking for when they're looking for money making opportunities. And it seems like the exact same thing is happening in our churches, that we are looking for the things that scare people in order to make opportunities out of them. Oh, gay people scare you. How do we make an opportunity out of that? You know, girls that have abortions scare you. How do we make an opportunity of that? We're going to talk about later. Women with strong opinions, they scare you. How do we make that an opportunity? And it seems like there's nothing churches won't do anymore to make a buck.
You know, and I want to say, like, you know, at a local level, you know, churches don't tend to be that way, right? You know, it's only churches that can leverage this kind of resources. So you're going to be talking about the Hillsongs, the Willow Creeks, the Harvests, you know,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, like I think that there's this huge conflation in many a Christian's mind that, oh, capitalism equals righteousness. It's like, no, these are not the same thing.
Right.
Like there's sort of like there's a requirement, right? We need to be kind of savvy, at least a little bit, with capitalism if we're going to live in a capitalist country. You know, like, you know, that Bible says, you know, be innocent as doves, but be shrewd as serpents, you know?
Yeah.
So we need to understand how these systems work. But yeah, it's like, it's too often that we see any church kind of conflating, you know, success with numbers.
Yeah.
And instead of saying, well, how healthy is the congregation we have? And just because you have people donating millions of dollars to your church and, you know, every week doesn't mean that you're making healthy people. It just means you're making a marketable product.
Exactly.
And, you know, I'm sure I've complained about it here before. I know I have, you know,
Sure.
said, you know, is that too often church is seen as a consumer product, you know, by churchgoers, but on the other side, it's all too often seen as a selling product to the people in charge.
Right. Exactly. And I think there's a misconception that capitalism and free markets are the same thing, and they're not.
Right.
Capitalism has the word capital at its core. Capitalism is about the accumulation of money, where free markets are about reaching a state of equilibrium. You sell a product, and if you have too much of a product and no demand, prices fluctuate. And the same thing, you can say that 4 different ways, but it all means the same thing. Products and people's money searching for equilibrium is what free markets are about. And it seems like churches have forgotten that we are not in the business of making money. We are in the business of forming followers, right? And so the free market of ideas is something incredibly important to functional churches versus dysfunctional churches, right? The ability to teach, the ability to take criticism, and to find that place where everybody can live well with themselves, with one another, and with God. And in these mega churches like Hillsong, we just see that doesn't matter. Like, the will of the people is of no consequence. All that matters is Brian Houston and his, 10 best buddies who lead this church, who are looking to stuff their money with as much money as they can before the ride ends.
Yeah. And with this whole thing of, Brian Houston leaving, permanently, but he says, well, his work in ministry isn't over. My brain kind of turned off. It's like, giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, is one thing, right? Like the Christian thing to say, okay, well, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. You can still do stuff in ministry. But he's 67. He's been in ministry for a long time. And, I'm not sure I could call it a success at this point, right? Like, it grew and it grew and it grew. Great. But we've had how many pastors? We've had 9 churches already leave Hillsong, with, I know, one more in the process of leaving. So that's 10 churches in like a fortnight.
Yeah.
And that was before he resigned,
right.
So it's like, whatever you did, boss, you did it poorly. You did it wrongly because, if you did it right, then your denomination should have survived you.
Right, exactly right. If you would have shepherded these churches well, like, a scandal at the highest level would have just been nothing more than a little speed bump, on the journey.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So I would like to, just because of what you just said, I would like to throw a theory by you and let me know how this tickles your ear.
Okay.
Okay. So, like you said, most of us don't live in megachurch world, especially like in these uber megachurches like Hillsong and Lakewood down in Texas, like these international church bodies, right? Most of us don't live in these worlds. Most of us kind of live in these churches that are like between 25 people and 1,000 people, let's say, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what happens for those of us who aren't in those megachurches, who don't have a vested interest in their success or their failure on a day-to-day basis, we just kind of go, oh, well, that's not my church. I don't have, like, yeah, it's an interesting article to read, but it doesn't affect me on my daily life. It doesn't affect my church. And so I don't need to worry about the ramifications about what this says about church in general, about the Bible, about Jesus, about the world's perception of what the church is. And they just kind of, well, I go to church and I'm happy, and so that's all. Like that kind of consumer mentality you were talking about. Not my church.
Yeah. And I would think you're probably hitting it on the head there. I think a lot of people, will see this and be like, yeah, well, that's their problem.
Yeah.
But we can't forget, a lot of our churches, are little, churches with 225 people, frequently are also singing Hillsong songs.
Right. Yeah.
And so, when you have something like Hillsong or Willow Creek or whatever, any of these big churches that become their own denominations, right? They have their own theologies.
Right.
And those theologies are basically exports, if you will, that other churches, smaller churches often consume. Right. So, if there is something at one of these churches like Hillsong that's screwed up and wrong, it can actually percolate down into our churches completely by accident. If somebody's looking at, not just worship tunes, right? And that's whatever it is. But like when somebody's looking at, like the leadership and like how they do things and, what they affirm and how they affirm it or whatever, it's like these things can percolate, pastors and, lay leadership. Let me say that again, lay leadership in local churches. They're not immune from influence.
Yeah.
And if we see something like Hillsong that seems to be, doing well and isn't like shouting, "Hail Satan," it's real easy for us to say, "Oh, okay, like they have it, they got it, they're doing it right."
Yeah.
Instead of us kind of looking more toward like, the second chapter of Acts or something, right? And seeing, how the church was then and saying, okay, well, how can that inspire us? And yeah, I know, maybe I'm out of line thinking that.
Membership is a double-edged sword.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think it should immediately raise red flags when you see no ability of the larger body to affect change in a church. I think that's bad. On the other hand, I think church leaders will use membership as a lever to extort money out of people. Well, you're a member, so you are obligated to tithe. Well, you're a member and you signed this contract that said you would tithe and you're not tithing, or you're not tithing enough, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think membership becomes a weapon to abuse people with, instead of just being a lovely statement of commitment from the churchgoer.
Yeah, I once heard about a church in California, and I wish I could remember what the church was so I could, publicly shame them.
Yeah.
But this church actually demanded of their members that their members submit their W-2s so the church could compare their receipts and make sure that they were actually tithing their 10%.
Yeah.
And like, what? Like, that's critically missing the point of Jesus, I think.
Yep. I don't remember which denomination it is. It's a major denomination, though, that publicly shames their pastors. Like they put out a list of the pastors tithing and who are the best and worst tithers in the denomination. And that's
horrible.
It's a public shaming. It's terrible. The terrible things that we do to one another in the name of Jesus is just mind-boggling. you know? And it's just like, no wonder people don't take the church seriously anymore. Like, it's not like we're just awful to the LGBTQ, or we're awful to any sort of non-traditional family, or we're awful to Muslims. Like, we are awful to one another in our own tent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, who wants to be part of that?
I don't know why anybody would want to be a part of it.
Yeah.
I mean, thankfully, some of the examples that we might be giving here are kind of like on the extreme end,
Right.
you know, and don't really represent the kind of mainline Christian thinking.
Yeah.
But at the same time, yeah, I get it. If somebody sees what we Christians are doing and says, y'all suck, I want no part of it, I get it. You know,
Yeah.
there's a quote, it was attributed to Gandhi. I don't know if he ever actually said it, but it was like, you know, I like your Christ, but I don't like your Christians, or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I like Jesus. As Christians, I can't stand, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we're going to keep an eye on this Hillsongs thing. It's obviously what people are talking about. And so we'll keep up to date. If you're watching this on the socials, shoot us some feedback. Let us know what you think, and what you think the next steps for Hillsong should be. We'd love to hear that from you.